Hi guys, in this episode we're going to look at the third issue on debates in the media, and that is specifically looking at how the future is affecting the media, right? And with that, largely how the internet is affecting media. So that's under the chapter of new media. And we're specifically going to look at this debate, that is, that states should subsidize online newspapers proportional to the number of readers that they have, which is, I think, a really interesting policy, and more than because I came up with it. Now, so as usual, I'm going to discuss what the debate is about, what are some major issues that you could see in the debate, and then briefly discuss the Gov approach to the debate, one possible Gov approach to the debate, and then one Op approach to the debate, right? And hope that you will continue and progress this debate and have many different versions of the debate. So let's get to understanding this debate. Now, it's about how the internet changed news, but specifically newspapers. Now, the internet changed many things, right? Human relationships, how people get content, who gets famous on YouTube, all those different things were changed, but the newspapers were particularly affected because newspapers depended on giving out news to people through, paper, through a very classical, traditional platform, and they depend on people buying their newspapers and advertisers then advertising in their papers. So they depended on having a wide readership base and people subscribing. Now, what happened when the internet came along is that people found news other ways, right? They went online, they followed blogs, and then now you have social media and you have Facebook, and some of these newspapers then went online. But they found it much harder to charge people when they went online, because people online are used to getting things either cheap or free, okay? And as a consequence, many newspapers just crumbled and squashed, right? Because people, especially small newspapers, why would I bother reading the small newspaper when I can now easily get online access to a large international newspaper? And whatever local news I need to get, I can get through blogs, I can get through social media. So the purpose, the service that small newspapers were fulfilling didn't become important anymore. So they disappeared, right? And even big newspapers were challenged because now it's so easy to compete. It doesn't matter whether or not your newsstand sells the New York Times or the Guardian or the International Herald Tribune or Le Monde or any newspaper. Online, you can get access to everything and you can pick and choose. So it made it much easier for people to compare and really affected the newspapers, and many of these newspapers died, right? They just disappeared. But so what? Many things died when there's too much competition. It doesn't mean we should subsidize everything, okay? So this debate isn't just about newspapers died, but about the value of those newspapers. Part of the reason why the newspapers died was because people got access to the news through the internet, through other means, through those blogs, through social media, and so on and so forth. But this debate is also about the quality of that news. Is the blogs or the other blogs and different websites and small, online SNS deliverers of news, are they providing the same sort of quality of news, the investigative journalism, the kind of long-term view that you get from established newspapers? Okay, so this debate is also about the quality of news. Have we lost something in the shift to online, and with newspapers changing the way they deliver news to people? Are those newspapers also sacrificing an important role that they play in society? Okay, so this debate is also about news and specifically how those newspapers, and by newspapers we mean established news media organizations, how they deliver the news and what is their relationship with the government. Okay, because newspapers is not just about providing entertainment or telling you about crisis and who died here and who died there, but about providing a check on government and a check on power. Newspapers with the capacity and the interest to do long investigative pieces are what shape public opinion. If you think back to major scandals, right? Corruption scandals, cheating in the government and all of these things, we often rely on the media to expose those things. And it has been the media largely that have done that, right? And they don't do it just because of their reach, because now with the internet, everybody has reach. If you have good content, that content will go viral. But they do it because through their abilities and their resource and their interests. So they go out there and they try to find these news, right? They interview people, they follow a trail of evidence, and sometimes this thing can take months, can take years to create good pieces of news, okay? So that's the inherent tension in this debate. The internet has changed how newspapers deliver news, and as a consequence, many newspapers have closed. But just, are we losing something? Are we losing investigative journalism? Do we need to help the newspapers stay online, right? Newspapers need to get money to stay online, and in order to get money to stay online, they either get readers to pay for that, which means maybe less readers can access the news. They need to get advertisers, which may change the way the news is delivered, or maybe the government can subsidize them. Why should the government subsidize them? Because they play an important role in checking the balance of power, and they serve the people, right? They're providing a public service. And that's why the government should help the newspapers to provide this public service. Pretty straightforward? Well, at least that's the gist of this debate from the government perspective, but also explaining why this debate is important, right? So you need to explain the role of newspapers. That's going to be the pretty much the most important thing in this debate, and how this public subsidy model will work. But I'll get into a little bit more detail when we look at the government case. Okay, so I'll be back. Okay, so let's try to understand the Gov approach. Now, the first thing here I think that's really important is defining newspapers and membership, right? So I think those are the only really two important things. I think this debate works in any country where they have old newspapers, established newspapers moving online, okay? But the important thing you need to talk about is, what are newspapers? So do you only want to talk about like a newspaper as in a newspaper, or any kind of media organization that serves the function of a newspaper? So for example, newspapers like the Huffington Post is a relatively new paper that never started out, that never had a print edition, and that only did online. Okay, so should they also receive some kind of subsidy? What if you are a video or a visual-based news organization that serves the same function? Should you also get a subsidy? I think yes. I think because what's important is the public service role that these organizations are fulfilling. If you are delivering news to people, right? If you are focused on, say, investigative journalism, and if you are trying to be a long-term established brand, not like a blog or a personal news, so if you serve a diversity and a variety of news, then we think you fit into what we qualify as a newspaper, and you deserve the subsidy. Okay, so I think it's better to take a broad approach and not just talk about like newspapers. Like you used to be a newspaper that, you know, I read in the morning, and now you're online and that's what I want. No, any kind of news organization that is principally the same. Trust me, it makes your case stronger because you don't have to defend contradictions or why this is different and that is different. Okay? The second thing is you need to talk about what do you mean by membership or readership? Is it just people who read, so the number of clicks or views that you have, which I don't think is a good idea because it's very open to abuse and you don't know whether someone read it? Or is it full on like, you know, membership? I have to sign up to the website, I have to give you my name or email address, or at least create some kind of profile. I think the latter approach is better. It places a slightly higher bar. People have to register and sign up, but it means that someone wants to receive news from this newspaper for a long period of time. So it's a better qualifier, right? So I think that's what you want to set, because then you also then shape the behavior of this newspaper. Because if it's just views, then what the newspaper does is push as many articles as it can quickly and short ones to get views. If you are measuring membership, is it who signs up to the site? It's free to sign up, but it takes a little bit of effort for me to sign up. But then you're going to make newspapers try to get people to sign up by knowing more about them, by trying to understand their interests and giving them things they want to receive, not just today or now, but across a long period of time. Okay, and that's what you're trying to create. You're trying to create a long-term consistency and role for these organizations. Okay, so newspaper, any organization that delivers news, and you can qualify what you mean by news. It should be diverse, it should be high quality, it shouldn't just be about entertainment. And membership, as in people who sign up to that organization, right? Sign up to receive that news. Great, so that's the kind of organizations that we're going to subsidize. Now, why should we subsidize it? 3 possible arguments. The first one is the public service role that these organizations play. Okay, and I think this is the most important argument. You need to establish this role, and you need to show that this is unique compared to blogs, compared to all these other things that exist on the internet, because the other side is probably going to say that the status quo is good enough and that's all we need now. We just need the status quo. So you need to show why this is different, right? And so the way I think you do it is first develop all the different things that an established newspaper or organization play. They are a check on government, they educate the public, focus on the long-term investigative pieces and articles that they develop. So it's not just reactive. It's not that something happens, I react, right? It's I do research, I create authentic news. And that's true, because if you look at a lot of the blogs or SNS, they share or refer to things that these established newspapers, these original news creation organizations do, right? The second thing is, I think, look at the long-term aspect, because you want to encourage longevity. And in the long term, you can have things like news archives, right? People can refer to pieces that they've done before in the past. And that's something that you get with newspapers that are unique. Okay, so like The Economist is a 100-year-old newspaper or magazine, like similar with the New York Times and all those established newspapers. They have a track record of doing things. They've done these things before. They've got expertise that they can keep and create and reuse. And they've got a history of content that they can reflect on. And you want that kind of quality. You want that kind of depth, right? To sustain and to grow. So develop this and focus on the quality and show why that's different. Talk about their staff, talk about their history, talk about if you have some great examples of big pieces in the past that have changed politics or society, show how they've fulfilled those roles and show how we need to sustain that in some shape and form. Okay, so I think if you can push this and show why it's unique to these newspapers, that's going to make your case super awesome. The second thing I think you need to talk about is focus on how then your model creates better news. Okay, so how this shapes and shifts the behavior of these newspapers to give you what you want and what's good for society, right? So I think the newspapers, and this was a little bit about what I discussed earlier. So if you say membership model, then the newspapers are going to try to get more readers, because having more readers means they get more money, right? Which is always a great thing, even for newspapers. But what they need to get long-term readers, not just people who want to click on articles. So what will this mean? This means that they will publish good news. They will publish great articles. They will publish things which invigorate people, that make people want to continue reading that newspaper, right? That has a strong public value. So what you're doing with these 2 arguments is you're justifying taxpayer investment, right? Because this will be paid for by the taxpayer, right? So why should the taxpayer pay for it? Because it serves the taxpayer, that's public service, and because you get all these great news from this model. This is a great model. And if you don't do this, then you will lose these things. Okay, so that's what you're arguing, and I think this needs to come out early. The second thing you can talk about is the harm. Now, not just the harm in the sense that if you don't do this, newspapers would die, and then you just have to get stuff from Facebook or BuzzFeed every day, which is not so bad, but it isn't really the investigative journalism stuff that shifts opinions, changes the world. But the harm from how newspapers are coping with this, right? So in the status quo, it's not all newspapers are dying. Like the most popular brands, the established newspapers survive largely through advertising revenue, because they get a lot of readers and they push a lot of ads, but also by selling some membership. So you have they have a free and paid content wall. So part of the site is free and part of the site is paid for only. So if you like the free stuff, they hope you move on to the paid stuff, right? So this means that they need to make a choice about what they want to give everyone and what they only want to give some people. And it also means that information is separated and segregated. Not everybody gets the good information. Those who can pay, who are willing to pay, get the better, more analysis, the better information. And you argue that this is a bad thing, right? So you show how the harm that the current approaches create is bad. It affects the quality of news, right? So how most people don't get the high quality news, and also because what they're trying to do now, they're trying to get advertisers, so this impacts the quality of the news, right? How does it do that? It creates a shift towards corporations. The news becomes corporate biased because I need to get, advertisers. That's my huge incentive. It's harder for me now to attack corporations. And in fact, sometimes you collude, you work together with corporations when you have things like native advertising. I'm not sure if you guys have heard of native advertising before, but this is when companies pay for articles in newspapers. And it makes it seem like it's, actually an article. There will be a small line at the bottom that says that this article was paid for by Shell. And the whole article is about how, fossil fuel companies are doing great things and changing things. So it seems like it's a legitimate news article, but actually it's subsidized. It's sponsored by corporations. And this is shifting the view of people and reducing the neutrality of these organizations. But they have to do it, right? Newspapers have to do it because they need money. Okay, so if you do this subsidy model, then what you're doing is effectively the government is advertising in these newspapers, right? Or helping them shift their advertising expenditure and allows them to be more neutral. So now I don't need to sell my soul to corporations, because if I have good news, then I'll get more readers and I'll get more money, so I don't need too many corporations. I probably will still have some corporations, but I'm not desperate for these corporations, right? And so can hold the quality of news. So this argument is about how in the status quo methods and alternatives don't really work, and they will lead to more harms. Right? What you're also trying to do here is trying to predict what the leader of opposition is going to come up to attack this case. Okay, so in response, we'll look at the leader of opposition's approach, but it's largely going to be about how you don't need this, right? So in opposition, you probably will say that it's a good public service, but they can play this role through other means, right? And the status quo and what's happening today works, and you downplay these harms, right? So if the status quo works, then you're not really losing the quality of news, and you won't get the kind of harms that you are that they think is going to happen. Okay, so that's the major approach on op in terms of how to rebut the government case. Okay, focus on how exactly it's affecting the newspapers. It's not affecting them too much, and when we discuss op in a little bit in a short while, I will show you how on op you can actually argue that the status quo is better, that the status quo creates more sustainability in the long term, and in fact the status quo is the one that leads to better, more awesome, killer news. Okay, so let's look at op, and after I magically clean this board. Cleaning. Right then, let's look at the opposition case. So on op, I think there are two main prongs, right? First one is that status quo rocks. You show how status quo is not just okay and can deal with the problem, but in fact is better. And that's the kind of mindset that you need to take. Move away from government protectionism. Okay, so you're selling a philosophy here, as well as showing that in the status quo, the problem can fix itself. And the second thing is that subsidy sucks. How subsidy creates more harm and is not really the role of the government, right? So let's look at the first one. Status quo rocks, okay? So what's happening in status quo? In status quo is corporations are learning to cope with the problem. Those who can't cope, shut down. And you think the shutdown's not such a bad thing because those newspapers were not relevant, not needed anymore. Things change, right? Businesses change. People don't read that many books. Some people stop writing books. They start writing online. That's a great thing because, it doesn't mean that we should keep paying for books if that's gone with the wind, right? So that's what's happening in the status quo, and that's good. That means people adjust. And that's a good mindset because the mindset shouldn't be that when something fails, the government will come and subsidize it and make sure it continues and it sustains. No. That leads to giant, fat, bloated governments, and then that means that things don't ever change. Okay, and we don't want that. We like things to change because at the end, as long as people are still interested and keen, that there is a demand, there will be some way to change things on the supply to fulfill that demand, and we think that that's happening. The newspapers are surviving. New York Times is doing really well with their paid model, their paid and free model, as is The Economist, as are everybody else, right? So that's the status quo that you are defending. Specifically, you talk about how you like market-driven solutions, okay? That as the market changes, these companies change, and that's what you mean by market-driven. So it will change based on the type of consumer that they're looking for. So if I sell only I focus more on getting business stuff, then very advertising heavy marketing model, or I want to get my consumers to pay, I think I can do that, or I want to give it free, whatever. It's driven by the market, and when the market changes, then I will have to change too. And that's another thing, that more changes are coming, right? Because in the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen the social media revolution. Most people don't read news directly from the websites. They read news from their social media feeds. You go on Facebook or on Twitter or whatever it is, and then you read links that people share, or you follow these organizations' social media profiles, right? I follow BBC, and you follow Le Monde or whatever it is, and then you read posts there. So you don't really subscribe to a membership. You're just reading things off their post. So this model won't solve that problem. The companies need to, again, adapt and change into something else. So that's why it's important to have this mindset that things are continuously changing. And as long as the companies create exciting and interesting news, people think that they're relevant, they will keep reading the news. That means that advertisers can keep advertising. And that also means that some people will pay. And that's a good message to send, that sometimes if you really like the content, you should pay, right? You should directly pay for it. And that's why we think that that's the more sustainable approach. Because as long as things keep changing, the message you need to send is that you should always keep changing yourself, and you need to be flexible. And the mindset of people that things should always be free maybe needs to change. And it's up to these companies to adjust and to manage that, right? So there are probably a few other arguments in there, like the mindset of people on the internet and how the model is changing and so on and so forth. But largely, you're defending the status quo, and you can split it into a few things. But the first thing, and the very important thing that you need to push on the opposition side is how the status quo is great. And in fact, the status quo is doing really, really well. And that's the position that governments need to take. Support corporations, but from a small government perspective, give them the freedom to be creative and come up with, to innovate, but don't subsidize them, because subsidy is stifling. And that's the second thing you're going to talk about, right? You're going to say that subsidy sucks. Subsidies are bad things that are a misuse of taxpayers' money, but also bad for corporations because it makes corporations think that I can depend on the government and I can just take money and things from the government, and we think that's a bad idea, right? So the first thing is that, it's government money, and this money can be used for so many other things, right? When governments have huge priorities, like helping the poor, like solving education, like dealing with healthcare, reforming the prison system. None of these things have market solutions, or very few market solutions. Whereas in the newspaper industry, we have these market solutions that are working. So you don't really need to use government money here. The need is not critical. The need is critical in other places, okay? But also, that government money must be used for genuine and clear public interests. When it comes to news can be, divisive. I don't want to subsidize Fox News, right? I don't read any Fox News. Maybe I don't have membership of any of these news organizations because I think they're all corrupt and they're all corporate driven. But hold on, why is my taxpayer money now being used to subsidize them? There's no way I benefit from them because I think they're lying to people constantly and like pushing corporate interests. So, I think that's unfair. Even if I don't go to prison, or if I don't use public education, or I don't use healthcare, I can see how that fits into a society and eventually interacts with me. But if I think news is doing something bad, or even certain news agencies are doing things that are bad, why should my taxpayer money be used to subsidize them? Okay, so there's an inherent unfairness argument that you can run from this notion of subsidy and government money. How government money has other more critical uses and areas where it needs to be used. And secondly, principally, it may offend some people. It's not helping everybody equally. It's different from like public utilities, okay? The second thing is, you can talk about, and both these ideas here are about how it impacts the behavior of this company. Because now the company is going to go into a race to sign members. And this is assuming that, the government team ran the membership model. That it just wants to sign members. It doesn't care whether members keep reading or not reading. I just need more members, right? Sign up, sign up, sign up, sign up, sign up. Then sign up, sign up, sign up, sign up, sign up. Which makes it really annoying, but also just tells people that you can just, sign up. So if you like this news, hey, don't bother paying for it. Just sign up as a member and then the government will pay for it. Which sends the wrong message, and which means that they may lose paying customers. Because right now, there are already people who pay. I pay for The Economist because I think it's a great news resource, right? People who can afford to pay for the New York Times, who read it regularly, pay for the New York Times. Many other people pay for different things which they think is good. So if there's good quality, you should pay. But when the government now does this sign up and I will subscribe and I will subsidize thing, then people just sign up, which means that they will lose money, which means that the newspapers make a net loss. So at least comes back to the same thing. Because they used to have lots of paying customers, and then there was subsidy, then paying customers dropped, so now they come back to the same. At least that's the argument you make on op, right? So then in a nutshell is the op case. The government response to this, of course, is that status quo does not rocks, that status quo is struggling, that it needs this solution, and that it won't lead to this kind of harms, and very importantly, justify the subsidy. So if on government, you did a great job developing the role of public news and these organizations, showing that they are unique, and showing how importantly the corporate culture perverts the news, right? Like changes their perspective, makes them less effective. Then it becomes then you can show how the subsidy is needed. Because without the subsidy, newspaper organizations will need more and more and more and more and more and more corporate involvement, which means they become even more and more corporatized. So the government needs to step in to create a little bit of balance, right? That's the government team's approach in regards to this problem. So, I don't know, it seems like a really balanced case to me, and one that I would enjoy arguing. But it should make you think about the role of news and news organizations in society. We consume so much of it, but what about the people who are creating it? And how are they being affected by changes in society? And how will those changes then come back and affect us? Okay, so have a really in-depth conversation about news, think about those organizations, and compare these two approaches to affecting their future. The future of new media is in your hands, or somewhere close to your hands. Have a great debate, guys.